Opabinia was for a century a unique, weird wonder of the Middle Cambrian Burgess Shale of Canada. Then a new species turned up in Utah from the same age, showing that they had diversified a little bit. So it was still a bit of a surprise to find another two specimens, possibly two species, in the Middle Ordovician in Wales. Hello everyone and welcome back, or welcome for the first time. It seems that still something like 70% of my watch time is by people who aren't subscribed, so you might want to help that statistic out a little bit. Right, today I'm going to be doing a little sort of interim one. I'm actually working on the next major instalment in the sponge history series, which is on the ancestry of demosponges, but I wanted to put something out while I'm preparing for that one. And this is one that's been on the list of things that I need to do for quite a long time. So when we first discovered the Castle Bank Biota, this Middle Ordovician Burgess Shale type fauna in the middle of Wales during the COVID lockdowns, we started finding a whole array of strange, sometimes mysterious and sometimes just mind-boggling little creatures. And one of the first papers was on two of these specimens that turned up in the first year of collecting, and so far we have yet to find another one. So we were obviously very lucky at the time, but we made the most of it. So you know how it is when you're sitting in a quarry in the middle of nowhere, breaking open rocks in the baking sun, and you split open a slab and there's this grey fuzzy sort of shape on the rock which you can barely make out any detail on, except for this little thing sticking out the front of it. And you spend about 5 seconds looking at it and say, I think I've got an opabiniid. So I handed it to Lucy, and she looked at it and said, oh yeah, you have, and gave it back again. This was about the time when we started realising just how big a thing Castlebank was going to be. So I'm going to have to go back a little bit and explain what opabiniids are. Okay. If you start with the huge array of arthropods that we have on the planet today, things like insects and crustaceans and spiders and all the rest, everything with these crunchy exoskeletons and jointed legs, and trace their evolution backwards, as far as you possibly can, they all tend to blend together into an array of mostly Cambrian things which start to get a little bit more ambiguous, but they still have this crunchy exoskeleton and jointed legs. But you go back even further, and you get into the realm of things before they evolved the crunchy exoskeleton and jointed legs. And obviously, at some point, there was one that didn't have legs, and didn't have the chitinous cuticle on the outside. At least, nothing like in the same form. So, their direct ancestors were probably something like lobopodians. These are almost caterpillar-like things. They've got stubby lobopods, which is basically lobe-shaped legs rather than ones with a jointed cuticle. And they don't have plates covering the surface, they've just got a fairly tough, leathery sort of cuticle. And between these sort of lobopods, lobopod-grade organisms, which probably evolved from something a bit like a paleoscolecid worm, have a look at the video on paleoscolecids if you want to go even further back. But between those and the things that are really recognisably crunchy arthropods, you have an array of what we call panarthropods, or stem group euarthropods. These include some of the most iconic Cambrian fossils, the most popular at least. I mean, obviously sponges should be more iconic, but sometimes arthropods get in the way. But you do get things like radiodonts, anomalocaris and stuff like that. And all sorts of strange gilled lobopodians where they started to develop outgrowths on the sort of flaps on the side of the body. And things like Kerygmachila, for example, have these huge grasping appendages at the front. So you have a wide array of adaptations in this early part of the arthropod history, which are making the most of what they have without having yet a really tough plated exoskeleton. And somewhere in the middle of all that was this really weird thing called Opabinia. It's a rare fossil, even in the Burgess Shale. I think there's something like 30 specimens have been found, and it's an extraordinary creature. It's been one of the most popular of the Burgess Shale menagerie for a long, long time, and you can get knitting patterns for them, you can get cuddly toys already made, you can get little plastic ones, and they're just amazingly cute. They have 5 eyes. That actually is not a surprise at all, because an awful lot of insects have 5 eyes. Everyone thinks of that as amazing, but look at a bee. Got 2 big eyes, then a triangle of 3 little ocelli in the middle of the head. 5 eyes. That's actually not that unusual. What is really unusual, even among lobopods, is this strange nozzle, a bit like a sort of vacuum cleaner coming out the front, or like an elephant's trunk, which has a claw at the end of it. And it is believed that this is probably for picking up food and then pushing it round to its mouth, which is actually on the underside or towards the back of the head. So, although there was a sort of canal running down the middle of this nozzle, we're not entirely sure what that was for, because it doesn't seem to have been able to ingest anything through it. But it's still adorably cute, isn't it? I mean, you can't go too far wrong with an opabiniid. But that was it. And it turns up in the Burgess Shale. It has this ridiculous morphology that is like nothing else. I mean, the radiodonts have 2 grasping appendages at the front with usually quite large spikes, sometimes filter feeding arrays if they become secondarily filter feeding, but they have appendages for catching food and then gathering it in, but they've got a pair of them. So to have this one long nozzle with a sort of claw at the end of it, it's a little bit different. And it was often cited as one of the classic examples of Cambrian animals exploring weird evolution. Dead end, didn't go anywhere, and it was just, you got these sort of weird things going on way back then before life had evolved properly. Okay, that seems like it was quite plausible that you just had a population which had managed to survive there, but it didn't do anything else. But then there was another species turned up in Utah from the same age, Middle Cambrian, which was called Utaurora. And this was a single specimen, not brilliantly preserved, but it seemed to show many of the characters of Opabinia. And it was sort of described as being something very close to Opabinia, despite the fact there wasn't vast amounts of detail in terms of all the critical features you might hope to see. But still, it was nice to see. And it showed that the opabiniids, the family that includes Opabinia and Utaurora only, actually had a bit more of a wider spread, that they had been more successful than was thought. They were still just in the Middle Cambrian and still just in North America, and in fact, really that sort of section of North America. They've never turned up in Xinjiang or any of these other Cambrian Burgess Shale type faunas around the world. They've not turned up in the Feswata biota in the early Ordovician. It looks like they were just a localised phenomenon. So when you are sitting in the middle of Wales and you find this thing and you think, that looks like an opabiniid, your first thought is, woohoo, that's quite exciting. Your second thought is, what? Because they are not meant to have spread outside this one continent, they're not meant to have been successful, they're not meant to have survived another 50 million years into the Middle Ordovician. But luckily we were already working with a lovely guy called Steve Bates, who had just published Utaurora. So we got on the email to him and thinking that this can't possibly be what we think it is, because, you know, arthropods are a bit of a foreign country to us. We don't pretend to be experts in them at all, but it certainly looked like it, and when we looked under the microscope we could see more and more detail that looked like it made sense. So we sent photos to Steve, and yeah, he got fairly excited. So that ended up with, inevitably, the next series of papers he was writing on these early panarthropods, and that was something that was going to be ongoing for a little while. He came and worked here for a few days on the microscopes. But during the process of preparing to write this up, I found another little tiny black speck on the rock, and with Castlebank most things are black specks. I mean, this new opabiniid was something like 15 millimetres long, which is ridiculously large for a Castlebank fossil, at least for anything really exciting, beyond sponges. But most of the time we're dealing with millimetre-sized things. And quite often the rock breaks through the fossil, so you see a little bit of the fossil exposed and the rest of it is still embedded in the rock. And you have to go and get the scalpels out and sit there for hours under the microscope trying to tease little bits of rock off to see what else turns up. So we had another one of many little black bits, and there I was sort of, oh, that's a bit odd. And did a little bit more, and that actually looks like it's got a sort of tail fin. Okay, and go to the other end. Oh, it's another opabiniid. And this one was only 3.5 millimetres long, but it was more or less complete, rather than the back end going off the rock. I sent photos of this one to Steve as well, and of course he got just as excited, and we ended up then writing up the two specimens. As I say, we have never yet found another one there, but those two had so much detail, albeit difficult to work with detail, but there was a lot of detail there, that it justified a paper. And eventually, 2022, before the main announcement of the fauna came out, this was published in Nature Communications. Now, when you look at a specimen like this, I totally get that, to start with, it's hard to see anything. We spent with Steve about 3 days here pouring down all the microscopes we've got and trying to tease out the details that we could see, work out what the orientation was, which bits were superimposed on which. And eventually we had something like a dozen figures in the paper, often with multiple lighting effects showing individual details, because that was the only way to actually show what information is in the fossil. It's not as beautifully preserved as some of the Burgess Shale ones, for example, but it does nonetheless show details that we don't see in the Burgess Shale ones. And so what we've got are a body, slightly obliquely twisted, with legs, lobopod legs, on the underside, flaps on the side with filaments on those flaps showing where the gills were. We have this trunk, the nozzle coming out of the front, proboscis, which has annulations and spines on it. We have the mouth and the anterior part of the gut. We have a sclerite on the top of the head, a rounded sclerite, instead of the 5 eyes. So presumably the eyes are still there, but they are underneath the sclerite. So they're light-sensitive spots, and the sclerite was probably translucent, and so it was just seeing through them. But it took a long time to work out the details and come up with this reconstructed diagram showing where all the features are that we're looking at. Now, it's mostly complete, but not entirely. So we don't have the posterior part. We don't have the last few body segments or the tail fan. We also don't have the end of the proboscis, so it fades out into the rock at that point, which is a shame, because we'd really like to see what was going on there, but it's not there, and that's what we got. But you do find a lot of very fine detail. So when you zoom into the mouth with the highest magnification that we had, you can see that it's actually a ring of plates. This is not surprising, because in radiodonts the mouth is a ring of plates, but we didn't really know what the mouth looked like in Opabinia. It's barely preserved clearly at all, and yet this thing is only 0.4 millimetres wide. That is tiny, and yet we can actually resolve individual plates around the mouth. Not perfectly clearly, but what do you expect? Come on. Some of the other features that were really well preserved include some of the rearmost lobopods that were visible, which have little spines coming off from the annulations at the joints and the wrinkliness of the limbs. And then we also have lots of little filaments, which are believed to be respiratory structures, coming off from the lateral flaps. So we have these sort of swimming flaps on the side, and near the back those come up towards the edge of the preserved fossil, and you can see lots of filaments coming off away from the margin of the fossil, as well as being superimposed on the flaps further towards the front. There is a lot of surprising detail. So there are some odd features. This clearly is not Opabinia itself. Aside from the lack of eyes and this plate over the front of the head, it also has the first of the lateral flaps seems to be much more solid, much more sclerotized and slightly enlarged compared with the other ones. And then on the proboscis, you have a series of dorsal spines coming out, as well as the normal annulations. So all of this leads to some quite interesting differences, which means it's very easy to describe a new species, new genus. And what we called it was Mieridduryn. This has a Welsh root, so it comes from the translation of bramble snout. Brambles being a very tangly sort of blackberry bush that you get in the UK. So you get fruit off them, but they're covered in spines. So brambles were a perfectly good origin for the name. A lot of people have been struggling a little bit with the pronunciation, but it's actually quite a logical language. There is a certain set of rules for pronunciation in Welsh which are different from in English, but once you know the rules it's quite straightforward. So we always give a guide to the pronunciation in the taxonomy. So Mieridduryn is how you say it, and not as one YouTuber basically gave up and called it Binks, which is imaginative at least, but you know. It's, yeah, hopefully people will get used to the pronunciation of these names because we're going to be using more of it. So that was one specimen. We only gave the name to that one. The other one was Castlebank Arthropod A. And in some ways this was just as well preserved. It was actually more complete. We still don't have the very tip of the proboscis, but we have the complete body form including the tail fan, which was rather nice. So you might be wondering why we would choose to name Mieridduryn but not give a formal name to this one. And the reason is that because of the difference in size, 15 millimeters or so for Mieridduryn and about 3.5 for the second one, we couldn't be 100% sure that they were not the same species with a radical change in form as they grew. This is something, unfortunately, that arthropods do. They have a larval stage, but even after that, the various stages leading up to the adult, as they get bigger, can change quite drastically in body form. So we have a second species which has quite drastic differences in body form, but without an understanding of the ontogeny, the development of Mieridduryn, we can't say 100% certainty that this thing was not a juvenile. What we're going to need for that is more specimens, either juvenile of Mieridduryn or an older growth stage of Castlebank Arthropod A, and then we'll be able to confirm or deny that they are separate species. So at the moment, well, we're pretty certain that they are distinct species, that there were two different opabiniid-like things here, but we can't prove it absolutely. And therefore we're being conservative and we just named the one and left the other one in what we call open nomenclature. So it doesn't do anything that is unchangeable. At that point, it leaves it open for the future. So what are the differences in this thing? Well, firstly, rather than having a nice simple round sclerite on top of its head, this one seems to have a pair of spiny sclerites on the sides of its head. Possibly there's also a trace of that of the round sclerite there as well, but that's uncertain. But certainly the slightly asymmetric sclerites with little spines on the anterior lower margin are very clear, and that is something which is unique to this. Such things like lateral sclerites are known in radiodonts. We'll come back to that sort of thing later. But they're not known in Opabinia. Then you have a series of odd structures behind the head on the dorsal side. Not quite sure what's going on there. Again, you'd want more specimens to be able to see them in different angles to work out whether it's just something that's broken or damaged or whether that's a real structure. But then the rest of it, we see nice and clearly the lobes down the side, and the tail fan is really rather lovely. Unfortunately, we can't compare the tail fan with the one in Mieridduryn because we don't have it in Mieridduryn, which is annoying. But it's quite similar to what we see in Utah Aurora, for example. So That's all nice. It has this proboscis coming out the front, and it has dorsal spines once more. And this is clearly another opabiniid-like animal. It has the nozzle, but it doesn't have the same features as the other ones. Sadly, with the single specimen in the one orientation, you don't quite know how far you can push the interpretation. So we could potentially have looked at more finer details, but you're just not certain whether they're real or not. So what we've got in the reconstructions are basically the details that we can be pretty confident on. Okay, so two opabiniids is quite exciting on its own. Two possibly distinct opabiniids is really exciting. I mean, that's more diverse than the Burgess Shale. But this is a very interesting thing ecologically. It shows that this group was actually diversifying into the Ordovician and just hasn't been preserved elsewhere, maybe because the taphonomic window, the preservation window, wasn't open in other sites, that you need this really soft tissue preservation to get a lot of this. Or it may be that we had a proliferation of these in Evolutionary, this little microcontinent, and not in the rest of the world. It's possible they died out elsewhere. And without more material from other sites around the world, we're not going to know that. But it's really, really interesting just to see that this morphology with the nozzle and the whole approach, the gilled lobopod with the proboscis, is something that was not just a weird dead end that died out in the Cambrian. It was able to cope even into the Middle Ordovician as an effective part of the ecosystem that was able to reproduce sufficiently well to survive and multiply. And that's an interesting thing in itself. It just shows that we really shouldn't be too dismissive of these weird oddball things, because everything that has evolved within that ecosystem and has survived. So anything that we see as a fossil has been successful enough to be common enough that it gets fossilized. That's actually quite an important point. It means that whatever it was that we're seeing, it was perfectly adapted to life at the time. So where does it actually fit into life at the time, though? Is it actually an opabiniid? This is where I get slightly sketchier, because arthropod phylogenetics are not my strong point. But at some point, hopefully, I'll be able to go into more detail in this and actually get Steve Pates on board as well and get him to talk about these things, which he knows far more intimately than I do. But what we can say is that there are some features of these opabiniid-like animals that actually are more similar to radiodonts than they are to Opabinia. So when we say, is it an opabiniid, what we're actually meaning is it in the family Opabiniidae? And the way that we do taxonomy nowadays, a family should be what we call monophyletic. It should be a natural group of the evolutionary tree. So you can have a sort of stem lineage of early arthropods, and one branch coming off there should give rise to a group of things which share certain features in common. And if that group includes Opabinia, that family would be the Opabiniidae. So if we're saying it's an opabiniid, then we're saying it is within this little cluster that has come off from the main branch, and they're all more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. This is where it gets tricky, because some of these features, like the spiny lateral plates on the side of the head, the sclerites, the spines on the proboscis, are features that are more reminiscent of things that you get in radiodonts. So, for example, in radiodonts, they have the pair of appendages, but on the outside edge of those appendages, there are often little spines where you have junctions between the plates, between the sclerites. And this is thought to be something to do with their articulation process. But before you get to the point of having articulated plates, you have to have a soft structure which then becomes plated, where the cuticle becomes thickened and articulated. So it becomes thickened not over the whole thing, but in sections. And if you have these little spikes on the outside coinciding with annulations across the appendage, then it's just possible that that could be the points at which the articulation of these appendages would later develop. So to explore these ideas, Steve brought in one of his colleagues, Joe Wolfe, as well, who he'd worked with previously on Uta Aurora, and came up with a cladistic analysis, looking at it was a previously established analysis, but then coding up these new taxa and inserting them in to see where they fit and whether it changes the tree at all. So a cladistic analysis, for those who don't know, is where you take a whole array of species, fossil species in this case, and then a whole array of characters. So things like dorsal sclerite, present or absent. And then you code whether those characters are there throughout this whole matrix, which can be quite a large pile of data. And then you plug it in through a computer, which then analyzes the different permutations of the possible arrangements of those branches to come up with the most plausible arrangement, or the arrangement that the data in the matrix best suggest for their evolutionary history. It's not 100% foolproof as a technique, but it's very commonly used and is very widely used among arthropod workers who are honing the techniques quite well. So, the end result of this is that what you end up with is a position of the Castle Bank Arthropods and Mieridduryn between Opabinia and the radiodonts. However, they then went on to do a slightly different analysis in which you say that these features, the particularly interesting ones like the lateral head sclerites and the spines on the proboscis, could be convergently evolved with what we see in radiodonts. And if you specify that, then you end up with them coming out with Opabinia. So in this case, it's slightly ambiguous. We have two possible scenarios. If you allow convergence, or explicitly allow convergence, then you end up with this scenario in which they are indeed opabiniids, and it is one clade which was just more successful than we thought. They survived not just outside North America, but well into the Ordovician. And that in itself is quite a nice result. But the other result, where this is not convergence, where these similarities to radiodonts are actually meaningful, is potentially more interesting, because what that means is that the opabiniid morphology, in a general sense, so this gilled lobopodian with a great big trunk at the front, was not just an offshoot. That was actually a part of the stem lineage of arthropods, that you trace all arthropods back and they go through a phase in which you have this nozzle coming at the front, which is rather an interesting idea. The idea would then be that this proboscis unzipped from the tip, in evolutionary terms, separating eventually into two separate appendages in the radiodonts. But in the other branch that leads to the modern arthropods, it was reduced to form what is now the labrum, a plate that sort of covers the edge of the mouth. If that's the case, we might expect to find more examples of these elsewhere. We might hope to find more fossils which show more combinations of characters that help to fill in the gaps in this evolutionary sequence, or which confirm that in fact these are convergent, and in fact these are just opabiniids. Just opabiniids. Ha. But until we get more material, more new species being described, we're not going to be absolutely certain on this. And that's just the way science is. This is a new result. It is one which leads to very interesting implications, but we're not sure exactly which implications those are as yet. So the paper took a while to do. It ended up being, I think, a year or so in the process, lots of review comments to deal with and so on. But it got through. And then we had this wonderful reconstruction done by Franz Antony as well, who very, very cleverly managed to hide the bits that we don't have information on. So yeah, it's a lovely piece of work, that. And it was published to quite a lot of excitement because everyone loves opabiniids. What can I say? I just wish we could find more of them for you, but it seems that they are quite scarce things. It's not as if just everything exciting turned up in the first year. We've had lots and lots of unique arthropods which have turned up since then, which are yet to be revealed, and those also are mostly single specimens. So it just seems to be the case that there are a lot of isolated single specimens that we're finding, And I don't know how many decades of collecting we're going to have to do before we start getting numerous examples of some of these things. Anyway, this was meant to be quite a short video, but at least it's given you an introduction to the lovely Mieridduryn and the Castle Bank Arthropod A, which one day, hopefully, will have its own name. There we go. Have a lovely Christmas, if I don't see you before. I probably will, actually. Working on another one, as I say. But, yes. Oh well, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon.